Chapter 21 of A Strange Manuscript Found in a Copper Cylinder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eddie Winter. A Strange Manuscript Found in a Copper Cylinder by James De Mille. Chapter 21. The Flying Monster. I retired to bed, but could not sleep. The offer of escape filled me with excited thoughts. These made sleep impossible, and as I lay awake, I thought that perhaps it would be well to know what might be Layla's plan of escape, for I might then make use of it to save Alma. I determined to find out all about it on the following jom, to question her as to the lands of the Gojin, to learn all her purpose. It might be that I could make use of that very plan to save Alma, but if not, why then I was resolved to remain and meet my fate with her. If Layla could be induced to take both of us, I was of course resolved to go, trusting to chance as to the claims of Layla upon me, and determined at all hazards to be faithful to Alma. But if she should positively refuse to save Alma, then I thought it possible that I might be able to find in Layla's plan of escape something of which I might avail myself. I could not imagine what it was, but it seemed to me that it might be something quite feasible, especially for a desperate man. The only thought I had was of escape by means of some boat over the seas. In a boat I would be at home. I could make use of a sail so as to elude pursuit, and could guide myself by the stars. The only thing that I wanted to know was the situation of the lands of the Gojin. On the following jom, the Kohen Gadol and Layla came quite early, and spent much time. I was surprised to see the Kohen Gadol devoting himself in an absurd fashion to Alma. It at once occurred to me that Layla had obtained her father's cooperation in her scheme, and that the old villain actually imagined that he could win the hand of Alma. To Alma herself I had said nothing whatever about the proposal of Layla, so that she was quite ignorant of the intentions of her companion, but it was excessively annoying to me to see such proceedings going on under my own eyes. At the same time I felt that it would be both unwise and uncivil to interfere, and I was also quite sure that Alma's affections were not to be diverted from me by anyone, much less by such an elderly party as the Kohen Gadol. It was very trying, however, and in spite of my confidence in Alma, my jealousy was excited, and I began to think that the party of philosophical radicals were not so agreeable as the orthodox cannibals whom I first met. As for Layla, she seemed quite unconscious of any disturbance in my mind. She was as amiable, as sprightly, as inquisitive, and as affectionate as ever. She even outdid herself, and devoted herself to me with an abandon that was quite irresistible. After Alma had left me, Layla came again, and this time she was alone. "I have come," said she, "to show you the way in which we can escape, whenever you decide to do so." It was the thing above all others which I wished to know, and therefore I questioned her eagerly about it, but to all of my questions she only replied that she would show me, and I might judge for myself. Layla led the way, and I followed her. We traversed long galleries and vast halls, all of which were quite empty. It was the sleeping time, and only those were visible who had some duties which kept them up later than usual. Faint twinkling lights but feebly illuminated the general gloom. At length we came to an immense cavern, which was darker than ever, and without any lamps at all. Through a vast portal, which was closed with a barred gateway, the beams of the brilliant aurora penetrated and disclosed something of the interior. Here Layla stopped and peered through the gloom, while I stood waiting by her side, wondering what means of escape could be found in this cavern. As I stood, I heard through the still air the sound as of living things. For a time I saw nothing, but at length I descried a vast shadowy form moving forward toward the portal, where the darkness was less. It was a form of portentous size and fearful shape, and I could not make out at first the nature of it. It surpassed all that I had ever seen. Its head was large and its jaws long, armed with rows of terrible teeth like those of a crocodile. Its body was of great size. It walked on its hind legs so as to maintain itself in an upright attitude, and in that position its height was over 12 feet. But the most amazing thing about this monster has yet to be told. As it walked, its forearms waved and fluttered, and I saw descending from them what seemed like vast folded leathern wings, which shook and swayed in the air at every step. Its pace was about as fast as that of a man, and it moved with ease and lightness. It seemed like some enormous bat, or rather like a winged crocodile, or yet again like one of those monstrous dragons of which I had read, but in whose actual existence I had never believed. Yet here I saw one living and moving before me, an actual dragon, with the exception of a tail, for that appendage which plays so great a part in all the pictures of dragons had no place here. This beast had but a short caudal appendage, and all its terrors lay in its jaws and in its wings. For a moment I stood almost lifeless with terror and surprise. Then I shrank back, but Layla laid her hand on my arm. "Don't be afraid," said she. "It's only an athaleb." "But won't it bite?" I asked, with a shudder. "Oh no," said Layla. "It swallows its victuals whole." At this I shrank away still further. "Don't be afraid," said Layla again. "Its jaws are muzzled, and besides, it's a tame athaleb. Its jaws are unmuzzled only at feeding time, but this one is very tame. There are 3 or 4 others in here, and all as tame as I am. They all know me. Come up nearer. Don't be afraid. These athalebs are easily tamed." "How can such tremendous monsters be tamed?" I asked in an incredulous tone. "Oh, men can tame anything. The athalebs are very docile when they are taken young. They are very long lived. This one has been in service here for 100 seasons and more." At this I began to regain my confidence, and as Layla moved nearer to the athaleb I accompanied her. A nearer view, however, was by no means reassuring. The dragon look of the athaleb was stronger than ever, for I could see that all its body was covered with scales. On its neck and back was a long ridge of coarse hair, and the sweep of its vast arms was enormous. It was with a quaking heart that I stood near, but the coolness of Layla reassured me, for she went close up, as a boy would go up to a tame elephant, and she stroked his enormous back, and the monster bent down his terrible head and seemed pleased. "This," said Layla, "is the way we have of escaping." "This!" I exclaimed doubtfully. "Yes," said she. "He is trained to the service. We can mount on his back, and he will fly with us wherever I choose to guide him." "What!" I exclaimed as I shrank back. "Fly? Do you mean to say that you will mount this hideous monster and trust yourself to him?" "Certainly," said Layla quietly. "He is very docile. There is harness here with which we can guide him. Should you like to see him harnessed?" "Very much indeed," said I. Upon this Layla walked up to the monster and stroked his breast. The huge athaleb at once lay down upon his belly. Then she brought 2 long straps like reins, and fastened each one to the tip of a projecting tip of each wing. Then she fastened a collar around his neck, to which there was attached a grappling line. "We seat ourselves on his back," said Layla. "I guide him with these reins. When we land anywhere, I fasten him with the grapple. He looks dull now, but if I were to open the gate and remove his muzzle, he would be off like the wind." "But can he carry both of us?" I asked. "Easily," said Layla. "He can carry 3 persons without fatigue." Could you mount on his back now, and show me how you sit?" Layla readily assented, and mounted with the greatest ease, seating herself on the broadest part of the back, between the wings. "Here," said she, "is room for you. Will you not come?" For an instant I hesitated, but then the sight of her seated there as coolly as though she were on a chair reassured me, and I climbed up also, though not without a shudder. The touch of the fearful monster was abhorrent, but I conquered my disgust and seated myself close behind Layla. Here she sat, holding the reins in her hands, with the grapple just in front of her, and seated in this position she went on to explain the whole process by which the mighty monster was guided through the air. No sooner had I found myself actually on the back of the athaleb than all fear left me. I perceived fully how completely tame he was, and how docile. The reins attached to his wings could be pulled with the greatest ease, just as one would pull the tiller ropes of a boat. Familiarity breeds contempt, and now, since the first terror had passed away, I felt perfect confidence, and under the encouragement of Layla I had become like some rustic in a menagerie, who at first is terrified by the sight of the elephant, but soon gains courage enough to mount upon his back. With my new found courage and presence of mind, I listened most attentively to all of Layla's explanations, and watched most closely the construction and fastening of the harness, for the thought had occurred to me that this athaleb might be of avail in another way, that if I did not fly with Layla, I might fly with Almah. This thought was only of a vague and shadowy character, a dim suggestion, the carrying out of which I scarce dared to think possible. Still it was in my mind, and had sufficient power over me to make me very curious as to the plans of Layla. I determined to find out where she proposed to go, and how far, to ask her about the dangers of the way and the means of sustenance. It seemed, I confess, rather unfair to Layla to find out her plans and use them for another purpose, but then that other purpose was Almah, and to me, at that time, every device which was for her safety seemed fair and honourable. "Here," said Layla, "here, Atam or, you see the way of escape. The athaleb can carry us both far away to a land where you need never fear that they will put you to death, a land where the people love light and life. Whenever you are ready to go, tell me. If you are ready to go now, say so, and at once I will open the door, and we shall soon be far away." She laid her hand on mine and looked at me earnestly, but I was not to be beguiled into any hasty committal of myself, and so I turned her proposal away with a question. "How far is it," I asked, "to that land?" "It is too far for one flight," said Layla. "We go first over the sea till we come to a great island, which is called Magones, where there are mountains of fire. There we must rest, and feed the athaleb on fish, which are to be found on the shore. The athaleb knows his way there well, for he goes there once every season for a certain sacred ceremony. He has done this for 50 or 60 seasons, and knows his way there and back perfectly well. The difficulty will be, when we leave Magones, in reaching the land of the Orin." "The Orin?" I repeated. "Who are they?" "They are the people among the Gojin who love life and light. It is their land that I wish to reach, if possible." "Where is it?" I asked eagerly. "I cannot explain," said Layla. "I can only trust to my own skill, and hope to find the place. We may have to pass over different lands of the Gojin, and if so, we may be in danger." "What is the reason why the athaleb goes to Magones every season?" I asked. "To take there the chief pauper of the season, who has won the prize of death by starvation. It is one of the greatest honours among the Kosekin." "Is Magones barren?" "It is an island of fire, without anything on it but craggy mountains and wild rocks, and flowing rivers of fire. It stands almost in the middle of the sea." "How can we get away from here?" I asked, after some silence. "From here? Why, I open the gates and the athaleb flies away. That is all." "But shall we not be prevented?" "Oh no. No one here ever prevents anyone from doing anything. Everyone is eager to help his neighbor. But if they saw me deliberately mounting the athaleb and preparing for flight, would they not stop me?" "No." I was amazed at this. "But," said I, "am I not a victim, preserved for the great sacrifice?" "You are, but you are free to go where you like and do what you like." "Your character of victim makes you most distinguished. It is the highest honor and dignity. All believe that you rejoice in your high dignity, and no one dreams that you are anxious to escape." "But if I did escape, would they not pursue me?" "Certainly not." "What would they do for a victim?" "They would wonder at your unaccountable flight, and then choose some distinguished pauper." "But if I were to stay here, would they not save me from death at my entreaty?" "Oh, certainly not. They would never understand such an entreaty. That's a question of death, the supreme blessing. No one is capable of such a base act as saving his fellow man from death. All are eager to help each other to such a fate." "But if I were to fly, they would not prevent me, and they would not pursue me?" "Oh no." "Are there any in the land who are exempt from the sacrifice?" "Oh yes, the Athons, Meleks, and Kohens. These are not worthy of the honor. The artisans and tradesmen are sometimes permitted to attain to this honor, the laborers in greater numbers, but it is the paupers who are chiefly favored. And this is a matter of complaint among the rich and powerful, that they cannot be sacrificed." "Well, why couldn't I be made an Athon or a Kohen, and be exempted in that way?" "Oh, that would be too great a dishonor. It would be impossible. On the contrary, the whole people are anxious to honor you to the very uttermost, and to bestow upon you the greatest privileges and blessings which can possibly be given. Oh no, it would be impossible for them to allow you to become an Athon or a Kohen. As for me, I am Malca, and therefore the lowest in the land, pitied and commiserated by the haughty pauper class, and shake their heads at the thought of one like me. All the people shower upon me incessantly new gifts and new offices. If my present love of light and life were generally known, they would punish me by giving me new contributions of wealth and new offices and powers, which I do not want." "But you love riches, do you not? And you must want them still." "No," said Layla, "I do not want them now." "Why, what do you want?" I asked. "You," said she, with a sweet smile. I said nothing, but tried desperately to think of something that might divert the conversation. Layla was silent for a few moments, and then went on in a musing tone. "As I was saying, I love you, Atam or, and I hate Almah because you love her. I think Almah is the only human being in all the world that I ever really hated, and yet, though I hate her, still, strange to say, I feel as though I should like to give her the immense blessing of death, and that is a very strange feeling indeed for one of the Kosekin. Do you understand, Atam or, what such can possibly be?" I did not answer, but turned away the conversation by a violent effort. "Are there any other athalebs here?" "Oh yes." "How many?" "4." "Are they all as tame as this?" "Oh yes, all quite as tame. There is no difference whatever." Upon this I left the back of the athaleb, and Layla also descended, after which she proceeded to show me the other monsters. At length she unharnessed the athaleb, and we left the cavern. End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of A Strange Manuscript Found in a Copper Cylinder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. A Strange Manuscript Found in a Copper Cylinder by James De Mille. Chapter 22. Escape. On the following jom I told everything to Almah. I told her that Layla was urging me to fly with her, and that I had found out all about her plans. I described the athalebs, informed her about the direction which we were to take, the island of fire, and the country of the Orin. At this intelligence Almah was filled with delight, and for the first time since we had come to the Amir there were smiles of joy upon her face. She needed no persuasion. She was ready to set forth whenever it was fitting, and to risk everything upon this enterprise. She felt as I did, and thought that the wildest attempt was better than this dull inaction. Death was before us here, and every jom as it passed only brought it nearer. True, we were treated with the utmost kindness. We lived in royal splendor. We had enormous retinues. But all this was a miserable mockery, since it all served as the prelude to our inevitable doom. For that doom it was hard indeed to wait. Anything was better. Far better would it be to risk all the dangers of this unusual and amazing flight, to brave the terrors of that drear isle of fire, Magones. Better to perish there of starvation, or to be killed by the hands of the hostile Kohen, than to wait here and be destroyed at last by the sacrificial knife of these smiling, generous, kind-hearted, self-sacrificing fiends, to be killed, aye, and afterward borne to the tremendous Mista-Kosek. There was difficulty with Layla that had to be guarded against. In the first place, that she might not suspect, and again that we might choose our time of escape when she would not be at all likely to find us out. We resolved to make our attempt without any further delay. Layla was with us for the greater part of that jom, and the Kohen Gadol also gave us much of his company. Layla did not seem to have any suspicions whatever of my secret purpose, for she was as bright, as amiable, and as devoted to me as ever, while the Kohen Gadol sought as before to make himself agreeable to Almah. I did not think fit to tell her about Layla's proposal, and therefore she was quite ignorant of the secret plans of the Kohen Gadol, evidently attributing his attention to the unfailing amiability of the Kosekin. Layla came again after Almah had retired, and spent the time in trying to persuade me to fly with her. The beautiful girl was certainly never more engaging, nor was she ever more tender. Had it not been for Almah, it would have been impossible to resist such sweet persuasions; but as it was, I did resist. Layla, however, was not at all discouraged, nor did she lose any of her amiability. But when she took leave, it was with a smile and sweet words of forgiveness on her lips for what she called my cruelty. After she left, I remained for a time with a painful sense of helplessness. The fact is, my European training did not fit me for encountering such a state of things as existed among the Kosekin. It's very easy to be faithful to one's own true love in England, when other fair ladies hold aloof and wait to be sought. But here, among the Kosekin, women have as much liberty in making love as men, and there is no law or custom about it. If a woman chooses, she can pay the most desperate attentions, and play the part of a distracted lover to her heart's content. In most cases the women actually take the initiative, as they are more impressible and impulsive than men, and so it was that Layla made me the object of her persistent assault, acting all the time, too, in accordance with the custom of the country, and thus having no thought whatever of indelicacy, since according to the Kosekin she was acting simply in accordance with the rights of every woman. Now where a woman is urged by one ardent lover to dismiss her other lover, she may sometimes find it difficult to play her part satisfactorily; but in my case I did not play my part satisfactorily at all. The ordeal was too hard, and I was utterly unable to show to Layla that firmness and decision of character which the occasion demanded. Yet, after all, the ordeal at last ended. Layla left, as I have said, with sweet words of forgiveness on her lips, and I, after a time, succeeded in regaining my presence of mind. Almah was waiting, and she soon joined me. We gathered a few articles for the journey, the chief of which were my rifle and pistol, which I had not used here, and then we set forth. Leaving our apartments, we traversed the long passages, and at length came to the cavern of the athalebs. We met several people on the way, who looked at us with smiles, but made no other sign. It was evident that they had no commission to watch us, and that thus far Layla's information was correct. Upon entering the cavern of the athalebs, my first feeling was one of helplessness, for I had no confidence whatever in my own powers of managing these awful monsters, nor did I feel that I could harness them. But the emergency was a pressing one, and there was no help for it. I had seen where Layla had left the harness, and now my chief desire was to secure one of the athalebs. The faint light served to disclose nothing but gloom, and I waited for a while, hoping that one of them would come forward as before. But waiting did no good, for no movement was made, and I had to try what I could do myself to rouse them. So I walked farther in toward the back part of the cavern, peering through the gloom, while Almah remained near the entrance. As I advanced, I heard a slight noise as of some one moving. I thought it was one of the athalebs, and walked on farther, peering through the gloom, when suddenly I came full upon a man who was busy at some work which I could not make out. For a moment I stood in amazement and despair, for it seemed as though all was lost, and as if this man would at once divine my intent. While I stood thus, he turned and gave me a very courteous greeting, after which, in the usual manner of the Kosekin, he asked me with much amiability what he could do for me. I muttered something about seeing the athalebs, upon which he informed me that he would show them to me with pleasure. He went on to say that he had recently been raised from the low position of Athon to that of feeder of the athalebs, a post involving duties like those of ostlers or grooms among us, but which here indicated high rank and honor. He was proud of his title of Epet, which means servant, and more than usually obliging. I at once took advantage of his complaisance, and requested him to show me the athalebs. Upon this he led the way farther on, where I could see through the gloom the shadowy outlines of 4 monsters, all of which were resting in an upright posture against the wall, with their claws fixed on a shelf of rock. They looked more than ever like dragons, or rather like enormous bats, for their wings were disclosed hanging in loose leathern folds. "Can they be roused," I asked, "and made to move?" "Oh yes," said the Epet, and without waiting for any further request, he proceeded to pull at the loose fan-like wing of the nearest one. The monster drew himself together, gave a flutter with his wings, and then moved back from the wall. "Make him walk," said I eagerly. The Epet at this pulled upon his wing once more, and the athaleb moved forward. "Bring him to the portal so that I may see him," said I. The Epet, still holding the athaleb's wing, pulled at him, and thus guided him toward the portal. I was amazed at the docility of this terrific monster, yet after all I thought that it was no more astonishing than the docility of the elephant, which in like manner allows itself to be guided by the slightest pressure. A child may lead a vast elephant with ease, and here with equal ease the Epet led the athaleb. He led him up near to the portal, where the aurora light beamed through far brighter than the brightest moon, and disclosed all the vast proportions of the monster. I stood and looked on for some time in silence, quite at a loss what to do next. And now Layelah's words occurred to me as to the perfect willingness of the Kosekin to do anything which one might wish. She had insisted on it that they would not prevent our flight, and had given me to understand that they would even assist me if I should ask them. This is what now occurred to me, and I determined to make a trial. So I said, "I should like to fly in the air on the athaleb. Will you harness him?" I confess it was with some trepidation that I said this, but the feeling was soon dissipated. The Epet heard my words with perfect coolness, as though they conveyed the most natural request in the world, and then proceeded to obey me, just as at home a servant might hear and obey his master, who might say, "I should like to take a ride. Will you harness the bay mare?" So the Epet proceeded to harness the athaleb, and I watched him in silence. But it was the silence of deep suspense, and my heart throbbed painfully. There was yet much to be risked. The gates had to be opened. Others might interfere. Layla might come. All these thoughts occurred to me as I watched the Epet, and though the labor of harnessing the athaleb was simple and soon performed, still the time seemed long. So the collar was secured around the neck of the athaleb with the grapple attached, and the lines were fastened to the wings, and then Almah and I mounted. The Epet now stood waiting for further orders. "Open the gates," said I. The Epet did so. Almah was seated on the back of the athaleb before me, holding on to the coarse mane. I, just behind, held the reins in my hand. The gates were opened wide. A few people outside, roused by the noise of the opening gates, stood and looked on. They had evidently no other feeling but curiosity. All was now ready, and the way was open, but there was an unexpected difficulty. The athaleb would not start, and I did not know how to make him. I had once more to apply for help to the Epet. "How am I to make him start?" I asked. "Pull at the collar to make him start, and pull at the reins to make him stop," said the Epet. Upon this I pulled at the collar. The athaleb obeyed at once. He rose almost erect, and moved out through the gate. It was difficult to hold on, but we did so. On reaching the terrace outside, the athaleb expanded his vast wings, which spread out over a space of full 50 feet, and then with vigorous motions raised himself in the air. It was a moment full of terror to both of us. The strange sensation of rising in the air, the quivering muscles of the athaleb at the working of the enormous pinions, the tremendous display of strength, all combined to overwhelm me with a sense of utter helplessness. With one hand I clung to the stiff mane of the monster. With the other I held Almah, who was also grasping the athaleb's hair, and thus for some time all thought was taken up in the one purpose of holding on. But at length the athaleb lay in the air in a perfectly horizontal position. The beat of the wings grew more slow and even, the muscular exertion more steady and sustained. We both began to regain some degree of confidence, and at length I raised myself up and looked around. It did not seem long since we had left, but already the city was far behind, rising with its long crescent terraces, sparkling and twinkling with innumerable lights. We had passed beyond the bay. The harbor was behind us, the open sea before us, the deep water beneath. The athaleb flew low, not more than 100 feet above the water, and maintained that distance all the time. It seemed, indeed, as if he might drop into the water at any time, but this was only fancy, for he was perfect master of all his movement, and his flight was swift and well sustained. Overhead the sky was filled with the glory of the aurora beams, which spread everywhere, flashing out from the zenith and illuminating the earth with a glow brighter than that of the brightest moon. Beneath, the dark waters of the sea extended, with the waves breaking into foam, and traversed by galleys, by merchant ships, and by the navies of the Kosekin. Far away the surface of the sea spread, with that marvelous appearance of an endless ascent, as though for 1,000 miles, rising thus until it terminated halfway up the sky, and so it rose up on every side, so that I seemed to be at the bottom of a basin-shaped world, an immense and immeasurable hollow, a world unparalleled and unintelligible. Far away, at almost infinite distances, arose the long lines of mountains, which, crowned with ice, gleamed in the aurora light, and seemed like a barrier that made forever impossible all ingress and egress. On and on we sped. At length we grew perfectly accustomed to the situation. The motion was so easy, and our seats were so secure. There were no obstacles in our way, no roughness along our path, for that pathway was the smooth air, and in such a path there could be no interruption, no jerk or jar. After the first terror had passed, there remained no longer any necessity for holding on. We could sit and look around with perfect freedom, and at length I rose to my feet, and Almah stood beside me, and thus we stood for a long time, with all our souls kindled into glowing enthusiasm by the excitement of that adventurous flight and the splendors of that unequaled scene. At length the aurora light grew dim, then came forth the stars, glowing and burning in the black sky. Beneath there was nothing visible but the darkness of the water, spotted with phosphorescent points, while all around a wall of gloom arose, which shut out from view the distant shores. Suddenly I was aware of a noise like the beat of vast wings, and these wings were not those of our athaleb. At first I thought it was the fluttering of a sail, but it was too regular and too long continued for that. At length I saw through the gloom a vast shadowy form in the air behind us, and at once the knowledge of the truth flashed upon me. It was another monster flying in pursuit. Were we pursued? Were there men on his back? Should I resist? I held my rifle poised, and was resolved to resist at all hazards. Almah saw it all, and said nothing. She perceived the danger, and in her eyes I saw that she, like me, would prefer death to surrender. The monster came nearer and nearer, until at last I could see that he was alone, and that none were on his back. But now another fear arose. He might attack our athaleb, and in that way endanger us. He must be prevented from coming nearer. Yet to fire the rifle was a serious matter. I had once before earned the danger of firing under such circumstances, when my Opmahera had fled in terror at the report, and did not wish to experience the danger which might arise from a panic-stricken athaleb. And so, as I stood there, I waved my arms and gesticulated violently. The pursuing athaleb seemed frightened at such an unusual occurrence, for he veered off and soon was lost in the darkness. End of chapter 22. Recording by Ralph Snelson, Springville, Utah.
Chapter 23 of A Strange Manuscript Found in a Copper Cylinder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. A Strange Manuscript Found in a Copper Cylinder by James De Mille. Chapter 23, The Island of Fire. At last there appeared before us what seemed like a long line of dull red fires, and as we looked we could see bursts of flame at fitful intervals, which shone out for a few moments and then died away. Upon this now our whole attention was fixed, for it seemed as though we were approaching our destination, and that this place was the Island of Fire, a name which from present appearances was fully justified. As we went on and drew steadily nearer, the mass of glowing fire grew larger and brighter, and what at first had seemed a line was broken up into different parts, one of which far surpassed the others. This was higher in the air, and its shape was that of a long, thin, sloping line, with a burning, glowing globule at each end. It seemed like lava running down from the crater of a volcano, and this appearance was made certainty on a nearer approach, for we saw at the upper point, which seemed the crater, an outburst of flame, followed by a new flow of the fiery stream. In other places there were similar fires, but they were less bright, either because they were smaller or more remote. At length we heard beneath us the roar of breakers, and saw long white lines of surf beating upon the shore. Our athaleb now descended and alighted. We clambered to the ground, and I, taking the grapple, fixed it securely between two sharp rocks. We were at last on Magones, the island of fire. The brightness of the aurora light had left us, but it needed not this to show us the dismal nature of the land to which we had come. It was a land of horror, where there was nothing but the abomination of desolation, a land overstrewn with blasted fragments of fractured lava blocks intermixed with sand,
from which there arose black precipices and giant mountains that poured forth rivers of fire and showers of ashes and sheets of flame.
A tremendous peak arose before us, with a crest of fire and sides streaked with red torrents of molten lava. Between us and it there spread away a vast expanse of impassable rocks, a scene of ruin and savage wildness which cannot be described, and all around was the same drear and appalling prospect. Here in the night season, the season of darkness and of awful gloom, we stood in this land of woe, and not one single sign appeared of life, save the life that we had brought with us. As for food, it was vain to think of it. To search after it would be useless. It seemed indeed impossible to move from the spot where we were. Every moment presented some new discovery which added to the horror of Magones. But Almah was weary, for our flight had been long, and she wished to rest. So I found a place for her where there was some sand between two rocks, and here she lay down and went to sleep. I sat a little distance off on a shelf of the rock, with my back against it, and here, after a little time, I also went to sleep. At length we awoke, but what a waking! There was no morning dawn, no blessed returning light to greet our eyes. We opened our eyes to the same scenes upon which we had closed them, and the darkness was still deep and dense around us. Over us both there was a sense of utter depression, and I was so deeply plunged into it that I found it impossible to rouse myself, even for the sake of saying words of cheer to Almah. I had brought a few fragments of food, and upon these we made our breakfast, but there was the athaleb to feed, and for him I found nothing, nor could I think of anything, unless he could feed upon rocks and sand. Yet food for him was a matter of the highest consequence, for he was all our support and stay and hope, and if the monster were deprived of food, he might turn upon us, and satisfy upon us his ravenous appetite. These thoughts were painful indeed, and added to my despondency. Suddenly I heard the sound of running water. I started away toward the place from which the sound came, and found only a little distance off a small brook trickling along on its way to the shore. I called Almah, and we both drank and were refreshed. This showed an easy way to get to the shore, and I determined to go there to see if there were any fish to be found. Shellfish might be there, or the carcasses of dead fish thrown up by the sea, upon which the athaleb might feed. I left my pistol with Almah, telling her to fire it if she heard me fire, for I was afraid of losing my way, and therefore took this precaution. I left it lying on the rock, full cocked, and directed her to point it in the air and pull the trigger. It was necessary to take these precautions, as of course she was quite ignorant of its nature. After this I left her and tried to follow the torrent. This, however, I soon found to be impossible, for the brook, on reaching a huge rock, plunged underneath it and became lost to view. I then went toward the shore as well as I could, now climbing over sharp rocks, now going round them, until at length, after immense labor, I succeeded in reaching the water. Here the scene was almost as wild as the one I had left. There was no beach whatever, nothing but a vast extent of wild fragments of fractured lava blocks, which were evidently the result of some comparatively recent convulsion of nature, for their edges were still sharp, and the water had not worn even those which were within its grasp to anything like roundness, or to anything else than the jagged and shattered outlines which had originally belonged to them. All the shore thus consisted of vast rocky blocks, over which the sea beat in foam. Eager to find something, I toiled along this rocky shore for a long distance, but without seeing any change. I was unwilling to go back baffled, yet I was at length compelled to do so. But the necessity of feeding the athaleb was pressing, and I saw that our only course now would be to mount him again, leave this place, and seek some other. But where could we go? That I could not imagine, and could only conclude to trust altogether to the instinct of the athaleb, which might guide him to places where he might obtain food. Such a course would involve great risk, for we might be carried into the midst of vast flocks of these monsters. Yet there was nothing else to be done. I now retraced my steps, and went for a long time near the sea. At length I found a place where the walking was somewhat easier, and went in this way up into the island and away from the sea. It seemed to lead in the direction where I wished to go. At length it seemed as if I had walked far enough, yet I could see no signs of Almah. I shouted, but there was no answer. I shouted again and again, but with the like result. Then I fired my rifle and listened. In response there came the report of the pistol far away behind me. It was evident that in coming back along the shore I had passed by the place where Almah was. There was nothing now left but to retrace my steps, and this I accordingly did. I went back to the shore and returned on my steps, shouting all the time, until at length I was rejoiced to hear the answering shout of Almah. After this it was easy to reach her. We now took up the grapple and once more mounted. The athaleb, eager to be off, raised himself quickly in the air, and soon our late resting place was far behind. His flight was now different from what it was before. Then he stood off in one straight line for a certain fixed destination, as though under some guidance. For though I did not direct him, still his long training had taught him to fly to Magones. But now training and guidance were both wanting, and the athaleb was left to the impulse of his hunger and the guidance of his instinct. So he flew no longer in one undeviating straight line, but rose high and bent his head down low, and flew and soared in vast circles, even as I have seen a vulture or a condor sweep about while searching for food. All the while we were drawing farther and farther away from the spot which we had left. We passed the lofty volcano. We saw more plainly the rivers of molten lava. We passed vast cliffs and bleak mountains, all of which were more terrific than all that we had left behind. Now the darkness lessened, for the aurora was brightening in the sky, and gathering up swiftly and gloriously all its innumerable beams, and flashing forth its lustrous glow upon the world. To us this was equal to the return of day. It was like a blessed dawn. Light had come, and we rejoiced and were exceeding glad. Now we saw before us, far beyond the black precipices, a broad bay with sloping shores, and a wide beach which seemed like a beach of sand. The surf broke here, but beyond the surf was the gentle sandy declivity, and beyond this there appeared the shores, still rocky and barren and desolate, but far preferable to what we had left behind. Far away in the interior arose lofty mountains and volcanoes, while behind us flamed the burning peak which we had passed. Here the athaleb wheeled in long circuitous flights, which grew lower and lower, until at length he descended upon the sandy beach, where I saw a vast sea monster lying dead. It had evidently been thrown up here by the sea. It was like one of those monsters which I had seen from the galley of the Kohen at the time of the sacred hunt. By this the athaleb descended, and at once began to devour it, tearing out vast masses of flesh, and exhibiting such voracity and strength of jaw that I could scarcely bear to look upon the sight. I fastened the grapple securely to the head of the dead monster, and leaving the athaleb to feed upon it, Almah and I went up the beach. On our way we found rocks covered with seaweed, and here we sought after shellfish. Our search was at length rewarded, for suddenly I stumbled upon a place where I found some lobsters. I grasped two of these, but the others escaped. Here at last I had found signs of life, but they were of the sea rather than of the shore. Delighted with my prey, I hastened to Almah to show them to her. She recognized them at once, and I saw that they were familiar to her. I then spoke of eating them, but at this proposal she recoiled in horror. She could not give any reason for her repugnance, but merely said that among her people they were regarded as something equivalent to vermin, and I found that she would no more think of eating one than I would think of eating a rat. Upon this I had to throw them away, and we once more resumed our search. At last we came to a place where numbers of dead fish lay on the sand. Nearer the water they were more fresh, and not at all objectionable. I picked up a few which looked like our common smelt, and found that Almah had no objection to these. But now the question arose how to cook them. Neither of us could eat them raw. A fire was necessary, yet a fire was impossible, for on the whole island there was probably not one single combustible thing. Our discovery therefore seemed to have done us but little good, and we seemed destined to starvation, when fortunately a happy thought suggested itself. In walking along I saw far away the glow of some lava which had flowed to the shore at the end of the sandy beach, and was probably cooling down at the water's edge. Here then was a natural fire, which might serve us better than any contrivance of our own, and toward this we at once proceeded. It was about 2 miles away, but the beach was smooth, and we reached the place without any difficulty. Here we found the edge of that lava flood, which seemed eternally descending from the crater beyond. The edge which was nearest the water was black, and the liquid fire, as it rolled down, curled over this in a fantastic shape, cooling and hardening into the form which it thus assumed. Here, after some search, I found a crevice where I could approach the fire, and I laid the fish upon a crimson rock, which was cooling and hardening into the shape of a vast ledge of lava. In this way, by the aid of nature, the fish were broiled, and we made our repast. There was nothing here to invite a longer stay, and we soon returned to the athaleb. We found the monster, gorged with food, asleep, resting upon his hind legs, with his breast supported against the vast carcass. Almah called it a jantanan. It was about 60 feet in length and 20 in thickness, with a vast horny head, ponderous jaws, and a back covered with scales. Its eyes were of prodigious size, and it had the appearance of a crocodile, with the vast size of a whale. It was unlike a crocodile, however, for it had fins rather than paws, and must have been as clumsy on the land as a seal or a walrus. It lay on its side, and the athaleb had fed itself from the uncovered flesh of its belly. There was nothing here to induce us to stay, and so we wandered along the beach in the other direction. On our right was the bay, on our left the rocky shore, which, beginning at the beach, ran back into the country, a waste of impassable rocks, where not a tree or plant or blade of grass relieved the appalling desolation. Once or twice we made an attempt to penetrate into the country, where openings appeared. These openings seemed like the beds of dried up torrents. We were able to walk but a few paces, for invariably we would come to some immense blocks of rock which barred all farther progress. In this way we explored the beach for miles, until it terminated in a savage promontory that rose abruptly from the sea, against which the huge billows broke in thunder. Then we retraced our steps, and again reached the spot where the athaleb was asleep by the jantannin. Almah was now too weary to walk any farther, nor was it desirable to do so, for indeed we had traversed all that could be visited. On one side of the beach was the sea, on the other the impassable rocks, at one end the promontory, at the other the lava fires. There was nothing more for us to do but to wait here until the athaleb should awake, and then our actions would depend upon what we might now decide. This was the question that was now before us, and this we began to consider. We both felt the most unspeakable aversion for the island, and to remain here any longer was impossible. We would once more have to mount the athaleb and proceed to some other shore. But where? Ah, there was the question. Not on the island, for it did not seem possible that in all its extent there could be one single spot capable of affording a resting place. Layla's information with regard to Magones had made that much plain. I had not taken in her full meaning, but now mine eyes had seen it. Yet where else could we go? Almah could not tell where, under the sky, lay that land which she loved. I could not guess where to go to find the land of the Orin. Even if I did know, I did not feel able to guide the course of the athaleb, and I felt sure that if we were to mount again, the mighty monster would wing his flight back to the very place from which we had escaped, the Amir. These thoughts weighed down our spirits. We felt that we had gained nothing by our flight, and that our future was dark indeed. The only hope left us was that we might be able to guide the course of the athaleb in some different direction altogether, so that we should not be carried back to the Kosekin. And now, worn out by the long fatigues of this job, we thought of sleep. Almah lay down upon the sand, and I seated myself, leaning against the rock a little distance off, having first reloaded my rifle and pistol. End of chapter 23. Recording by Ralph Snelson, Springville, Utah.
Chapter 24 of A Strange Manuscript Found in a Copper Cylinder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. A Strange Manuscript Found in a Copper Cylinder by James De Mille. Chapter 24. Recapture. How long I slept I do not know, but in the midst of my sleep there sounded voices which at first intermingled themselves with my dreams, but gradually became separate and sounded from without, rousing me from my slumbers. I opened my eyes drowsily, but the sight that I saw was so amazing that in an instant all sleep left me. I started to my feet and gazed in utter bewilderment upon the scene before me. The aurora light was shining with unusual brilliancy and disclosed everything: the sea, the shore, the athaleb, the jantannin, the promontory, all more plainly and more luminously than before. But it was not any of these things that now excited my attention and rendered me dumb. I saw Almah standing there at a little distance with despairing face, surrounded by a band of armed Kosekin, while immediately before me, regarding me with a keen glance and an air of triumph, was Layla. "Etos misore alonna," said she, with a sweet smile, giving me the usual salutation of the Kosekin. I was too bewildered to say a word, and stood mute as before, looking first at her and then at Almah. The sight of Almah, a prisoner once more, surrounded by the Kosekin, excited me to madness. I seized my rifle, and raised it as to take aim, but Almah, who understood the movement, cried to me, "Put down your sepet rom, Atamor. You can do nothing for me. The Kosekin are too numerous." "Sepet rom," said Layla. "What do you mean by that? If your sepet rom has any power, do not try to use it, Atamor, or else I shall have to order my followers to give it to Almah, the blessing of death." At this my rifle was lowered, the whole truth flashed upon me, and I saw too the madness of resistance. I might kill one or two, but the rest would do as Layla said, and I should speedily be disarmed. Well I knew how powerless were the thunders of my firearms to terrify these Kosekin, for the prospect of death would only rouse them to a mad enthusiasm, and they would all rush upon me as they would rush upon a jantannin, to slay and be slain. The odds were too great. A crowd of Europeans could be held in check far more easily than these death-loving Kosekin. The whole truth was thus plain: we were prisoners and were at their mercy. Layla showed no excitement or anger whatever. She looked and spoke in her usual gracious and amiable fashion, with a sweet smile on her face. "We knew," said she, "that you would be in distress in this desolate place, and that you would not know where to go from Magones, and so we have come, full of the most eager desire to relieve your wants. We have brought with us food and drink, and are ready to do everything for you that you may desire. We have had great trouble in finding you, and have coursed over the shores for vast distances and far over the interior, but our athalebs found you at last by their scent, and we rejoice to have found you in time, and that you are both so well, for we have been afraid that you had been suffering. Nay, Atamor, do not thank us. Thanks are distasteful to the Kosekin. These brave followers of mine will all be amply rewarded for this, for they will all be made paupers. But as for myself, I want no higher reward than the delightful thought that I have saved you from suffering." The beautiful smiling Layla, who addressed me in this way with her sweet voice, was certainly not to be treated as an enemy. Against her a rifle could not be levelled. She would have looked at me with the same sweet smile, and that smile would have melted all my resolution. Nor could I even persist in my determination to remain. Remain? For what? For utter despair? And yet where else could we go? "You do not know where lie the lands of the Orin," said Layla. "The athaleb does not know. You could not guide him if you did know. You are helpless on his back. The art of driving an athaleb is difficult, and cannot be learned without long and severe practice. My fear was that the athaleb might break away from you and return, leaving you to perish here. Had you tried to leave this place, he would have brought you back to the Emir." To this I said nothing, partly because it was so true that I had no answer to make, and partly also out of deep mortification and dejection. My pride was wounded at being thus so easily baffled by a girl like Layla, and all my grief was stirred by the sadness of Almah. In her eyes there seemed even now the look of one who sees death inevitable, and the glance she gave to me was like an eternal farewell. Almah now spoke, addressing herself to Layla. "Death," said she, in a voice of indescribable mournfulness, "is better here than with you. We would rather die here than go back. Let us, I pray you, receive the blessing of death here. Let us be paupers and exiles, and die on Magones." Layla heard this, and stood for a moment in deep thought. "No one but a stranger," said she at length, "would ask such a favor as that. Do you not know that what you ask is among the very highest honors of the Kosekin? Who am I that I can venture to grant such a request as that? Ask for anything in my power, and I will be glad to grant it. I have already arranged that you shall be separated from Atamor, and that surely is a high privilege. I might consent to bind you hand and foot, after the manner of the more distinguished Azorin. You may also be blindfolded if you wish it. I might even promise, after we return to the Emir, to keep you confined in utter darkness, with barely sufficient food to keep you alive until the time of the sacrifice. In short, there is no blessing known among the Kosekin that I will not give, so long as it is in my power. And so, beloved Almah," continued Layelah, "you have every reason for happiness. You have all the highest blessings known among the Kosekin: separation from your lover, poverty, want, darkness, and finally the prospect of inevitable death ever before you as the crowning glory of your lot." These words seemed to the Kosekin the very excess of magnanimity, and involuntary murmurs of admiration escaped them, although it is just possible that they murmured at the greatness of the favor that was offered. But to me it sounded like fiendish mockery, and to Almah it sounded the same, for a groan escaped her. Her fortitude gave way. She sank on her knees, buried her head in her hands, and wept. "Almah," I cried in a fury, "we will not go back. We will not be separated. I will destroy all the athalebs, and we shall all perish here together. At least you and I will not be separated." At this Almah started up. "No, no," said she. "No, let us go back. Here we have nothing but death." "But we have death also at the Amir, and a more terrible one," said I. "If you kill the athalebs," said Layelah, "I will give Almah the blessing of death." At this I recoiled in horror, and my resolution again gave way. "You have some mysterious power of conferring death," continued Layelah, "with what Almah calls your sepetram; but do not kill the athalebs, for it will do you no good. Almah would then receive the blessing of death. My followers, these noble Kosekin, would rejoice in thus gaining exile and death on Magones. As for myself, it would be my highest happiness to be here alone with you. With you I should live for a few sweet yoms, and with you I should die. So go on, kill the athalebs if you wish." "Do not," cried Almah, "do not. There is no hope. We are their prisoners, and our only hope is in submission." Upon this all further thought of resistance left me, and I stood in silence, stolidly waiting for their action. As I looked around I noticed a movement near the jantannin, and saw several athalebs there, which were devouring its flesh. I now went over to Almah and spoke with her. We were both full of despair. It seemed as though we might never meet again. We were to be separated now, but who could say whether we should be permitted to see each other after leaving this place? We had but little to say. I held her in my arms, regardless of the presence of others, and these, seeing our emotion, at once moved away with the usual delicacy of the Kosekin, and followed Layelah to the jantannin to see about the athalebs. At last our interview was terminated. Layelah came and informed us that all was ready for our departure. We walked sadly to the place and found the athalebs crouched to receive their riders. There were 4 beside ours. Layelah informed me that I was to go with her, and Almah was to go on another athaleb. I entreated her to let Almah go with me, but she declined, saying that our athaleb could only carry 2, as he seemed fatigued, and it would not be safe to overload him for so long a flight. I told her that Almah and I could go together on the same athaleb, but she objected on the ground of my ignorance of driving, and so, remonstrances and objections being alike useless, I was compelled to yield to the arrangements that had been made. Almah mounted on another athaleb. I mounted with Layelah, and then the great monsters expanded their mighty wings, rose into the air, and soon were speeding over the waters. We went on in silence for some time. I was too despondent to say a word, and all my thoughts turned toward Almah, who was now separated from me, perhaps forever. The other athalebs went ahead at long intervals apart, flying in a straight line, while ours was last. Layelah said nothing. She sat in front of me, her back was turned toward me. She held in her hands the reins, which hung quite loose at first, but after a while she drew them up and seemed to be directing our course. For some time I did not notice anything in particular, for my eyes were fixed upon the athaleb immediately before us, upon which was seated the loved form of Almah, which I could easily recognize. but our athaleb flew slowly, and I noticed that we were falling behind. I said this to Layelah, but she only remarked that it was fatigued with its long journey. To this I objected that the others had made as long a journey, and insisted that she should draw nearer. This she at first refused to do, but at length, as I grew persistent, she complied, or pretended to do so. In spite of this, however, we again fell behind, and I noticed that this always happened when the reins were drawn tight. On making this discovery, I suddenly seized both reins and let them trail loose, whereupon the athaleb at once showed a perceptible increase of speed, which proved that there was no fatigue in him whatever. This I said to Layelah. She acquiesced with a sweet smile, and taking the reins again, she sat around so as to face me, and said, "You are very quick. It is no use to try to deceive you, Atam or. I wish to fall behind." "Why?" "To save you." "To save me?" "Yes, I can take you to the land of the Orin. Now is the time to escape from death. If you go back, you must surely die. But now, if you will be guided by me, I can take you to the land of the Orin. There they all hate death. They love life. They live in the light. There you will find those who are like yourself. There you can love and be happy." "But what of Almah?" I asked. Layelah made a pretty gesture of despair. "You are always talking of Almah," said she. "What is Almah to you? She is cold, dull, sad. She never will speak. Let her go." "Never," said I. "Almah is worth more than all the world to me." Layelah sighed. "I can never, never, never," said she, "get from you the least little bit of a kind word, even after all that I have done for you, and when you know that I would lie down and let you trample me under your feet, if it gave you any pleasure." "Oh, that is not the question at all," said I. "You are asking me to leave Almah, to be false to her, and I cannot." "Among the Kosekin," said Layelah, "it is the highest happiness for lovers to give one another up." "I am not one of the Kosekin," said I. "I cannot let her go away. I cannot let her go back to the Emir, to meet death alone. If she dies, she shall see me by her side, ready to die with her." At this Layelah laughed merrily. "Is it possible," said she, "that you believe that? Do you not know that if Almah goes back alone she will not die?" "What do you mean?" "Why, she can only die when you are in her company. She has lived for years among us, and we have waited for someone to appear whom she might love, so that we might give them both the blessing of death. If that one should leave her, Almah could not receive the blessing. She would be compelled to live longer, until some other lover should appear. Now, by going with me to the land of the Orin, you will save Almah's life; and as for Almah, why, she will be happy, and dear papa is quite willing to marry her. You must see, therefore, dear Atam or, that my plan is the very best that can be thought of for all of us, and above all for Almah." This, however, was intolerable, and I could not consent to desert Almah, even if by doing so I should save her life. My own nature revolted from it. Still, it was not a thing which I could dismiss on the instant. The safety of Almah's life indeed required consideration. But then the thought came of her wonder at my desertion. Would she not think me false? Would not the thought of my falsity be worse than death? "No," said I will not leave her, not even to save her life. Even among us there are things worse than death. Almah would rather die by the sacrificial knife than linger on with a broken heart." "Oh no," said Layelah, sweetly. "She will rejoice that you are safe. Do you not see that while you are together death is inevitable, but if you separate you may both live and be happy?" "But she will think me dead," said I, as a new idea occurred. "She will think that some accident has befallen me." "Oh no, she won't," said Layelah. "She will think that you have gone off with me." "Then that will be worse, and I would rather die, and have her die with me, than live and have her think me false." "You are very, very obstinate," said Layelah, sweetly. I made no reply. During this conversation I had been too intent upon Layela's words to notice the athalebs before me, but now as I looked up I saw that we had fallen far behind, and that Layela had headed our athaleb in a new direction. Upon this I once more snatched the reins from her, and tried to return to our former course. This, however, I was utterly unable to do. Layela laughed. "You will have to let me guide our course," said she. "You can do nothing. The athaleb will now go in a straight line to the land of the Orin." Upon this I started up in wild excitement. "Never, never, never!" I cried in a fury. "I will not. I will destroy this athaleb and perish in the water." As I said this I raised my rifle. "What are you going to do?" cried Layela in accents of fear. "Turn back," I cried, "or I will kill this athaleb." Upon this Layela dropped the reins, stood up, and looked at me with a smile. "Oh, Atam or," said she, "what a thing to ask! How can I go back now when we have started for the land of the Orin?" "We shall never reach the land of the Orin," I cried. "We shall perish in the sea." "Oh no," said Layela, "you cannot kill the athaleb. You are no more than an insect. Your rod is a weak thing, and will break on his iron frame." It was evident that Layela had not the slightest idea of the powers of my rifle. There was no hesitation on my part. I took aim with the rifle. At that moment I was desperate. I thought of nothing but the swift flight of the athaleb, which was bearing me away forever from Almah. I could not endure that thought, and still less could I endure the thought that she should believe me false. It was therefore in a wild passion of rage and despair that I levelled my rifle, taking aim as well as I could at what seemed a vital part under the wing. The motion of the wing rendered this difficult, however, and I hesitated a moment so as to make sure. All this time Layela stood looking at me with a smile on her rosy lips and a merry twinkle in her eyes, evidently regarding my words as empty threats and my act as a vain pretense, and utterly unprepared for what was to follow. Suddenly I fired both barrels in quick succession. The reports rang out in thunder over the sea. The athaleb gave a wild, appalling shriek, and fell straight down into the water, fluttering vainly with one wing, while the other hung down useless. A shriek of horror burst from Layela. She started back, and fell from her standing place into the waves beneath. The next instant we were all in the water together, the athaleb writhing and lashing the water into foam, while I involuntarily clung to his coarse mane, and expected death every moment. But death did not come, for the athaleb did not sink, but floated with his back out of the water, the right pinion being sunk underneath and useless, and the left struggling vainly with the sea. But after a time he folded up the left wing and drew it close in to his side, and propelled himself with his long hind legs. His right wing was broken, but he did not seem to have suffered any other injury. Suddenly I heard a cry behind me: "Atam or! Oh, Atam or!" I looked round and saw Layla. She was swimming in the water, and seemed exhausted. In the agitation of the past few moments I had lost sight of her, and had thought that she was drowned; but now the sight of her roused me from my stupor, and brought me back to myself. She was swimming, yet her strokes were weak, and her face was full of despair. In an instant I had flung off my coat, rolled up the rifle and pistol in its folds, and sprung into the water. A few strokes brought me to Layela. A moment more and I should have been too late. I held her head out of water, told her not to struggle, and then struck out to go back. It would have been impossible for me to do this encumbered with such a load, had I not fortunately perceived the floating wing of the athaleb close beside me. This I seized, and by means of it drew myself with Layla alongside, after which I succeeded in putting her on the back of the animal, and soon followed myself. The terror of the rifle had overwhelmed her, and the suddenness of the catastrophe had almost killed her. She had struggled in the water for a long time, and had called to me in vain. Now she was quite exhausted, and lay in my arms trembling and sobbing. I spoke to her encouragingly, and wrapped her in my coat, and rubbed her hands and feet, until at last she began to recover. Then she wept quietly for a long time. Then the weeping fit passed away. She looked up with a smile, and in her face there was unutterable gratitude. "Atam said she, "I never loved death like the rest of the Kosekin, but now I feel that death with you would be sweet." Then tears came to her eyes, and I found tears coming to my own, so that I had to stoop down and kiss away the tears of Layla. As I did so, she twined both her arms around my neck, held me close to her, and sighed. "Oh, Atam death with you is sweet. And now you cannot reproach me. You have done this yourself, with your terrible power, and you have saved my life to let me die with you. You do not hate me then, Atam do you? Just speak once to a poor little girl, and say that you do not hate her." All this was very pitiable. What man that had a heart in his breast could listen unmoved to words like these, or look without emotion upon one so beautiful, so gentle, and so tender? It was no longer Layla in triumph with whom I had to do, but Layla in distress. The light banter, the teasing, mocking smile, the kindling eye, the ready laugh, all were gone. There was nothing now but mournful tenderness, the timid appeal of one who dreaded a repulse, the glance of deep affection, the abandonment of love. I held Layla in my arms, and I thought of nothing now but words of consolation for her. Life seemed over, death seemed inevitable, and there on the back of the athaleb we floated on the waters and waited for our doom. End of chapter 24. Recording by Ralph Snelson, Springville, Utah. Chapter 25 of A Strange Manuscript Found in a Copper Cylinder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. A Strange Manuscript Found in a Copper Cylinder by James De Mille. Chapter 25. Falling like Icarus into the Sea. The aurora light, which had flamed brightly, was now extinct, and darkness was upon the face of the deep where we floated on the back of the monster. He swam, forcing himself onward with his hind legs, with one broad wing folded up close. Had both been folded up, the athaleb could have swum rapidly, but the broken wing lay expanded over the water, tossing with the waves, so that our progress was but slight. Had it not been for this, the athaleb's own instinct might have served to guide him toward some shore which we might have hoped to reach before life was extinct. But as it was, all thought of reaching any shore was out of the question, and there arose before us only the prospect of death, a death, too, which must be lingering and painful and cruel. Thus amid the darkness we floated, and the waves dashed around us, and the athaleb never ceased to struggle in the water, trying to force his way onward. It seemed sweet at that moment to have Layla with me, for what could have been more horrible than loneliness amid those black waters? And Layla's mind was made up to meet death with joy, so that her mood conveyed itself to me, and I thought that since death was inevitable, it were better to meet it thus, and in this way end my life, not amid the horrors of the sacrifice and the Mista Kosek, but in a way which seemed natural to a seafaring man like myself, and with which I had long familiarized my thoughts. For I had fallen upon a world and among people which were all alien and unintelligible to me, and to live on would only open the way to new and worse calamities. There was peace also in the thought that my death would snatch the prospect of death from Almah. She would now be safe. It was only when we were together as lovers that death threatened her. But now, since I was removed, she could resume her former life, and she might remember me only as an episode in that life. That she would remember me I felt sure, and that she would weep for me and mourn after me was undeniable. But time, as it passed, would surely alleviate that grief, and Almah would live and be happy. Perhaps she might yet regain her native land, and rejoin her loved kindred, whom she would tell of the stranger from an unknown shore who had loved her, and through whose death she had gained her life. Such were the thoughts that filled my mind as I floated over the black water with darkness all around, as I held Layla in my arms, with my coat wrapped around her, and murmured in her ear tender words of consolation and sympathy. A long, long time had passed, but how long I know not, when suddenly Layla gave a cry and started up on her knees, with her head bent forward, listening intently. I too listened, and I could distinctly hear the sound of breakers. It was evident that we were approaching some shore, and from what I remembered of the shore of Magones, such a shore meant death, and death alone. We stood up and tried to peer through the gloom. At length we saw a whole line of breakers, and beyond all was black. We waited anxiously in that position, and drew steadily nearer. It was evident that the athaleb was desirous of reaching that shore, and we could do nothing but await the result. But the athaleb had his wits about him, and swam along on a line with the breakers for some distance, until at length an opening appeared, into which he directed his course. Passing through this, we reached still water, which seemed like a lagoon surrounded by a coral reef. The athaleb swam on farther, and at length we saw before us an island with a broad sandy beach, beyond which was the shadowy outline of a forest. Here the monster landed, and dragged himself wearily upon the sand, where he spread his vast bulk out and lay panting heavily. We dismounted, I first, so as to assist Layla, and then it seemed as if death were postponed for a time, since we had reached this place where the rich and rank vegetation spoke of nothing but vigorous life. Fortune had indeed dealt strangely with me. I had fled with Almah, and with her had reached one desolate shore, and now I found myself with Layla upon another shore, desolate also, but not a savage wilderness. This lonely island, ringed with the black ocean waters, was the abode of a life of its own, and there was nothing here to crush the soul into a horror of despair like that which was caused by the tremendous scenes on Magones. In an instant Layla revived from her gloom. She looked around, clapped her little hands, laughed loud, and danced for joy. "Oh, Atam or!" she cried. "See, see the trees! See the grass, the bushes! This is a land of wonder. As for food, you can call it down from the sky with your sepet ram, or we can find it on the rocks. Oh, Atam or, life is better than death, and we can live here, and we can be happy. This shall be better to us than the lands of the Orin, for we shall be alone, and we shall be all in all to one another." I could not help laughing, and I said, "Layla, this is not the language of the Kosekin. You should at once go to the other side of this island and sit down and wait for death." "Never," said Layla. "You are mine, Atam or, and I never will leave you. If you wish me to die for you, I will gladly lay down my life, but I will not leave you. I love you, Atam or, and now whether it be life or death, it is all the same so long as I have you." Our submersion in the sea, and our long exposure afterward, had chilled both of us, but Layla felt it most. She was shivering in her wet clothes in spite of my coat, which I insisted on her wearing, and I determined, if possible, to kindle a fire. Fortunately my powder was dry, for I had thrown off my flask with my coat before jumping into the sea, and thus I had the means of creating fire. I rubbed wet powder over my handkerchief, and then gathered some dried sticks and moss. After this I found some dead trees, the boughs of which were dry and brittle, and in the exercise I soon grew warm, and had the satisfaction of seeing a great heap of faggots accumulating. I fired my pistol into the handkerchief, which, being saturated with powder, caught the fire, and this I blew into a flame among the dried moss. A bright fire now sprang up and blazed high in the air, while I, in order to have an ample supply of fuel, continued to gather it for a long time. At length, as I came back, I saw Layla lying on the sand in front of the fire, sound asleep. I was glad of this, for she was weary, and had seemed so weak and tremulous that I had felt anxious. So now I arranged my coat over her carefully, and then sat down for a time to think over this new turn which my fortune had taken. This island was certainly very unlike Magones, yet I had no surety but that it might be equally destitute of food. This was the first question, and I could not think of sleep until I had found out more about the place. The aurora light, which constantly brightens and lessens in this strange world, was now shining gloriously, and I set forth to explore the island. The beach was of fine sand all the way. The water was smooth and shut in on every side by an outer reef against which the sea waves broke incessantly. As I walked, I soon perceived what the island was, for I had often seen such places before in the South Pacific. It was, in fact, a coral islet with a reef of rocks encircling it on every side. The vegetation, however, was unlike anything in the world beyond, for it consisted of many varieties of tree ferns that looked like palms, and giant grasses and bamboo. The island was but small, and the entire circuit was not over a mile. I saw nothing that looked like food, nor did it seem likely that in so small a place there could be enough sustenance for us. Our only hope would be from the sea, yet even here I could see no signs of any sort of shellfish. On the whole, the prospect was discouraging, and I returned to the starting point with a feeling of dejection. But this feeling did not trouble me much at that time. My chief thought was of rest, and I flung myself down on the sand and fell asleep. I was awakened by a cry from Layla. Starting up, I saw her standing and looking into the sky. She was intensely excited. As soon as she saw me, she rushed toward me and burst into tears, while I, full of wonder, could only stare upward. "Oh!" cried Layla, "they've turned back! They've found us! We shall have to leave our dear, lovely island. Oh, Atam or, I shall lose you now, for never, never, never again will you have one thought of love for your poor Layla." With these words she clung sobbing to me. For my part, I do not remember what I said, for the sight above was so amazing that it took up all my attention. The aurora shone bright, and in the sky I saw two vast objects wheeling and circling, as if about to descend. I recognized them at once as athalebs, but as their backs were hid from my view by their immense wings, I could not make out whether they were wanderers about to alight of their own accord, or guided here by riders, perhaps by the Kosekin from whom we had been parted. This much at least I remember. I said to Layelah that these athalebs were wild ones, which had come here because they saw or scented our wounded one. But Layla shook her head with mournful meaning. "Oh no," said she, "Almah has come back for you. This firelight has guided them. If you had not made the fire, they never, never, never could have found us. But now all is lost." There was no time for conversation or discussion. The athalebs drew swiftly nearer and nearer, descending in long circuits until at length they touched the ground not far away on the wide sandy beach. Then we saw people on their backs, and among them was Almah. We hurried toward them, and Almah rushed into my arms, to the great disgust of Layelah, for she was close beside me and saw it all. She gave an exclamation of grief and despair and hurried away. From Almah I learned that our disappearance had caused alarm, that two of the athalebs had come back in search of us, that they had been to Magones and had searched over the seas and were just about giving us up as lost, when the firelight had attracted their attention and drawn them here. I said nothing at that time about the cause of our disappearance, but merely remarked that the athaleb had fallen into the sea and swam here. This was sufficient. They had to remain here for some time longer to rest their athalebs. At length we prepared to depart. Our wounded athaleb was left behind to take care of himself. I was taken with Almah, and Layelah went on the other. We were thus separated, and so we set forth upon our return, and at length arrived at the amir. End of chapter 25. Recording by Ralph Snelson, Springville, Utah.